The sound was piercing. It wasn't just the harsh grinding of a tow winch locking onto a rusted steel bumper. It was the metallic screech of a monumental mistake. Homeowners Association President Richard Vance stood on the sidewalk laughing as the crane lifted the battered truck. He thought he was cleaning up his neighborhood. He thought he was the king. But as the quiet older man on the porch calmly buttoned his jacket, revealing 4 silver stars, Richard didn't know that in exactly 14 minutes, military police would swarm his perfect street and end his reign forever. The morning sun crested the horizon, bleeding a pale, almost sterile light over the ruthlessly manicured lawns of the Shady Pines residential community. It was a neighborhood built on the illusion of absolute perfection. A sprawling suburban labyrinth of identical pristine facades, flawlessly edged driveways, and aggressively vibrant flower beds that looked more plastic than natural. The air here was usually filled with the gentle hum of expensive electric lawnmowers and the quiet whispers of neighborhood gossip. But in the quiet sanctuary of the dawn before the chaotic symphony of suburban life began, there was a profound stillness. Standing in the driveway of the only house that dared to possess a soul in this ocean of conformity was Arthur Sterling. At 68 years old, Arthur was a man carved from bedrock. He wore faded denim jeans, stained with the rich dark earth of his garden, and a frayed olive-drab flannel shirt that hung loosely over his broad, unforgiving shoulders. To the untrained eye, he looked like a hired groundskeeper, an elderly man clinging to the simple labor of tending to hydrangeas and pruning rose bushes. But a closer look revealed a posture that defied gravity and age. His spine was perfectly straight, a permanent physical echo of 42 years of rigorous military discipline. His hands, currently caked in potting soil, were heavily calloused thick and steady as they handled a heavy set of gardening shears. Across his jawline ran a thin, jagged white scar, a silent souvenir from a piece of twisted shrapnel taken during a night extraction in the unforgiving desert of Fallujah. Arthur didn't live in the past, but the past lived in him. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, a predator's economy of motion where no energy was ever wasted. His eyes, a piercing icy blue, scanned the quiet street with the rhythmic precision of a sweeping radar array. It was an involuntary habit drilled into him during decades in active war zones. He was a man who appreciated the profound silence of a peaceful morning precisely because he had spent a lifetime surviving the deafening roar of war. He was a retired 4-star general, a man who had commanded massive theaters of combat and directly advised presidents in the Situation Room. But here he simply wanted to be Arthur. He knelt beside a bed of soil, adjusting a wooden stake with the exact same meticulous care he once used to review highly classified satellite reconnaissance imagery. Beside him in the driveway sat the anomaly. It was a 1970 Ford F-150 pickup truck. Its original paint faded into a muted, chalky green. It didn't shine. It didn't gleam. It stood in stark, almost offensive contrast to the gleaming Teslas and polished Mercedes-Benz sport utility vehicles that populated every other driveway in Shady Pines. The truck's heavy steel body was heavily scarred, marred by deep indentations, patches of oxidized metal, and a series of very distinct asymmetrical holes clustered near the driver's side door. They weren't rust holes. They were the entry points of 7.62 millimeter rounds, sustained during a brutal convoy ambush decades ago. The vehicle had carried Arthur and his wounded men out of a relentless danger zone, its engine screaming, its tires shredded, refusing to die until they reached the safety of the perimeter. The Pentagon had originally intended to scrap it, but Arthur had fought a fierce bureaucratic war to keep it. It was currently registered under a highly classified Department of Defense Historical Preservation Act. It was a literal museum piece, sitting quietly on a suburban driveway, carrying a dark metal government tag instead of a standard state license plate. Arthur stood up and pulled a clean white rag from his back pocket. He ran the coarse cloth over the hood, wiping away the morning dew with a gentleness he rarely showed to human beings. He didn't keep the truck for vanity or nostalgia. He kept it because history demanded a physical witness and because it grounded him. It was a monument to the brave men who didn't come back, the ones who had spent their final breaths onto its cracked vinyl seats. He checked the pressure in the front left tire, leaning his formidable weight against the heavy steel frame. For Arthur, the rust was a badge of honor. The deep dents were battle scars. The truck was a survivor just like him. He breathed in the cool morning air, grateful for another day of absolute peace. But he didn't know that his hard-earned peace was about to be shattered by a man who measured his own worth in inches of grass. 2 streets over from Arthur's quiet sanctuary, a very different kind of morning ritual was taking place. Richard Vance, the deeply feared and universally despised president of the Shady Pines Homeowners Association, was preparing for his daily patrol. Richard was 45 years old, a man whose entire existence was defined by the desperate clawing need to assert control over a world that largely ignored him. In his professional life, he was a mid-level manager at a regional logistics firm, a man whose days consisted of organizing mundane spreadsheets and sending passive-aggressive emails. He had never built anything of lasting value. He had never fought for anything greater than a corner cubicle. But here within the iron-wrought gates of Shady Pines, Richard was a god. He viewed this neighborhood not as a community, but as his own personal kingdom, a sovereign state where his word was absolute law, and his aesthetic preferences were holy commandments. He stepped out of his front door, inhaling the crisp morning air, not to appreciate its freshness, but to actively smell for unauthorized barbecue smoke or the scent of unapproved fertilizer. He wore a cheap, off-the-rack polyester suit that he mistakenly believed projected an aura of Wall Street dominance paired with heavily gelled hair. His shoes, thick-soled and over-polished, squeaked entirely too loudly on the pavement, announcing his arrival like a grim reaper of suburban conformity. In his right hand, he clutched a heavy leather-bound clipboard. It was his scepter, his weapon, his ultimate instrument of terror. Clipped tightly to it were 50 pages of hyper-specific neighborhood bylaws, a document he had personally amended over the years to include draconian regulations on everything from the acceptable shades of beige for exterior paint to the maximum allowable decibel level of a wind chime. Richard began his march down the meticulously swept sidewalks. His eyes darted back and forth behind thin wire-rimmed glasses, scanning the pristine environment with the frantic paranoid energy of a dictator looking for an uprising. He thrived on the quiet terror he instilled. If a garbage can was left out an hour past the collection window, Richard was there. If a child's bicycle was left on a front lawn, Richard confiscated it. He loved the way the curtains twitched and then quickly closed as he walked past, mistaking their deep visceral revulsion for respect. He genuinely believed he was the thin, blue line protecting Shady Pines from the encroaching forces of chaos and low property values. He paused abruptly at the Jenkins residence, dropping to one knee with a heavy grunt. From his breast pocket he produced his most feared tool, a bright yellow plastic ruler. He pressed it aggressively into the damp grass, his thin lips curling into a triumphant sneer as he noted the blades were exactly 3/8 of an inch above the mandated 2-inch limit. He eagerly scribbled a citation, writing the $150 fine with a flourish. This pathetic micro-exercise of power sent a rush of pure dopamine straight to his brain. He slapped the violation notice onto the custom mailbox, standing up with a smug sense of accomplishment. With his ego temporarily fed, Richard adjusted his tie and turned the corner onto Elm Street. His squeaking shoes set a marching tempo as he mentally prepared to inspect the gutter alignments. And then he saw it. His heart rate spiked instantly. A hot flush of indignity crept up his thick neck, turning his face a blotchy shade of crimson as his eyes locked onto Arthur Sterling's driveway. The abhorrence, the absolute insult. Sitting there in plain view of the entire neighborhood was the 1970 Ford F-150. To Richard Vance, it was a glaring middle finger to everything he had worked to build. It was an infection spreading across his perfect canvas. His mind raced with a toxic cocktail of superiority and disgust. He didn't see the history in the bullet holes. He saw vandalism. He didn't see the faded paint as character. He saw poverty. He had noticed the old man move in recently, keeping quietly to himself, and Richard had already decided Arthur was beneath him. He assumed the old man was a retired factory worker who had somehow scrounged up enough pension money to buy the smallest house on the block. A blue-collar, nobody dragging the prestige of the zip code down. Richard gripped his clipboard so tightly, his knuckles turned a ghastly white. He marched toward Arthur's property, the plastic soles of his shoes slapping angrily against the concrete, fully prepared to crush this peasant under the absolute weight of his authority. Richard stopped at the edge of the driveway, his squeaking shoes coming to an abrupt halt. He stood with hands on his hips, his chest puffed out under his cheap polyester suit. Before him sat the offending object, the 1970 Ford F-150. To Richard, it wasn't a vehicle. It was an act of open rebellion. It was a visual assault on the pristine landscape of Shady Pines. He narrowed his eyes at the faded, chalky green paint. In a neighborhood where residents hired professional detailing services on a weekly basis, this dull, unpolished metal was nothing short of a crime against property values and a personal insult to his leadership. He let out a theatrical, disgusted sigh, making sure it was loud enough to be heard by anyone watching from a window. He began to circle the truck, moving with the exaggerated swagger of a building inspector finding a critical structural failure. He tapped his yellow plastic ruler against his leg as he walked, a nervous tic disguised as true authority. He paused at the driver's side door, leaning in close, his nose wrinkling in profound distaste. He stared at the clustered asymmetrical holes punched through the thick steel. Rust, he thought to himself with a cruel sneer. Pure, unadulterated, negligent rust. His arrogant mind was so thoroughly disconnected from the real world that he couldn't process what he was looking at. He didn't see the distinct grouping of 7.62 millimeter entry wounds from an insurgent ambush in the heart of a hostile city. He didn't see the heavy military-grade reinforced plating bolted underneath the chassis. He only saw a derelict piece of junk, a cancerous blight threatening his curated kingdom. Richard moved to the rear of the vehicle. He sneered at the heavy steel bumper, dented and scarred from ramming through concrete barricades decades ago in a desert he couldn't point to on a map. Then he looked for the license plate. Instead of a standard colorful state-issued tag, there was only a heavy dark metal plate stamped with a stark sequence of white numbers and an obscure federal seal. Richard blinked, his brow furrowing. He had never seen a plate like that. But rather than pause and consider that he might be out of his depth, his fragile ego instantly filled the gap with righteous anger. Unregistered, he decided immediately. Unlicensed and completely illegal. A blatant disregard for the civilized society he worked so hard to maintain. He aggressively flipped through his heavy leather clipboard. He tapped his pen against the paper with a triumphant rhythm. Section 4, Paragraph B, Clause 7 of the Shady Pines Master Covenant. No heavily damaged, inoperable, or aesthetically displeasing vehicles shall be stored in open view. It was an open and shut case. A guaranteed, undeniable victory. He began to scribble furiously on a bright orange citation pad, his handwriting sharp and aggressive. He thrived on this. This was his high. He assumed the owner was just some broke blue-collar, nobody who had scrounged up enough money to buy the smallest house on the block, dragging the prestige of the zip code into the mud. Richard didn't care about the man's story or his current circumstances. He only cared about the rules because the rules gave him power. He ripped the bright orange violation sticker from the pad. It was a massive, highly adhesive warning meant to stick stubbornly to glass and publicly shame the owner. He held it in his hand like a weapon, feeling a surge of absolute authority coursing through his veins. He looked toward the house, searching for the peasant who dared to bring this trash into his realm. He spotted the old man kneeling in the dirt near the porch, wearing stained clothes and holding heavy gardening shears. A groundskeeper, Richard thought dismissively. Or worse, the owner himself doing his own yard work like a common laborer. Richard cracked his neck, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He was about to deliver a brutal lesson in suburban hierarchy. He was going to crush this man's pathetic defiance, and he was going to enjoy every single miserable second of it. Richard marched up the pristine concrete of the driveway, the cheap polyurethane soles of his shoes squeaking with every aggressive step. He stopped a few feet away from the kneeling figure, his chest puffed out, his heavy leather clipboard held firmly against his side like a shield of authority. He looked down his nose at the older man tending to the hydrangeas. To Richard's hypercritical status, obsessed eyes, the sight was utterly offensive. The man's faded denim jeans were stained at the knees with dark, damp earth. The olive-drab flannel shirt hung loosely over his frame, visibly frayed at the cuffs and collar. Richard felt a surge of smug validation. His initial assumption had been absolutely correct. This man wasn't a high-powered executive. He wasn't a doctor or a lawyer. He was a nobody, a blue-collar relic who had somehow slipped through the cracks of the Shady Pines financial vetting process, bringing his lower-class habits into Richard's perfect kingdom. "Excuse me." Richard barked his voice, carrying a nasal, high-pitched frequency that was accustomed to cutting through neighborhood board meetings and silencing dissenting residents. It was a tone meticulously designed to demand immediate compliance. Arthur didn't jump. He didn't startle. He didn't even pause his work. The heavy metal gardening shears in his thick, calloused hands moved with the exact same deliberate, rhythmic precision. He carefully placed a severed branch into a woven basket beside him. He had heard the squeaking shoes from half a block away. He had catalogued the erratic, heavy breathing of an out-of-shape civilians looking for a fight long before Richard even opened his mouth. In 42 years of active military service, Arthur had faced down hostile interrogators, ruthless warlords, and silent insurgents. A hyperventilating middle manager in a cheap polyester suit wasn't a threat. He was barely a distraction. I said. "Excuse me," Richard repeated, taking an aggressive step closer, his face flushing with the heat of unacknowledged authority. "Are you the homeowner or the hired help?" Arthur slowly pressed his hands against his thighs and rose to his feet. He didn't groan or complain of the ache in his 68-year-old joints. He stood up to his full towering height, his spine locking into a posture of absolute unyielding discipline. When he finally turned to face the intruder, the air in the driveway seemed to instantly drop in temperature. Richard expected to see the submissive, apologetic face of an elderly man caught breaking the rules. Instead, he found himself staring into a pair of buckish blue eyes that were entirely devoid of fear, respect, or even basic human warmth. They were the eyes of an apex predator. They swept over Richard in a fraction of a second, a rapid involuntary radar scan that assessed the man's posture, his breathing, and the trembling in his hands, instantly dismissing the Homeowners Association president as a zero-level threat. Richard swallowed hard, a sudden, inexplicable knot forming in his throat. But his bloated ego violently pushed him forward. He adjusted the lapels of his suit, desperately trying to project an air of upper-class superiority. He waved his clipboard toward the rusted Ford F-150. "I'm Richard Vance, president of the Shady Pines Homeowners Association," Richard announced, heavily emphasizing his title. "I don't know how things worked in whatever trailer park you crawled out of, buddy, but around here we have standards." Richard looked Arthur up and down, his lip curling in undisguised disgust at the dirt on the old man's heavy boots. He was measuring the man entirely by the worn fabric of his shirt, completely blind to the terrifying stillness of his demeanor. "We have a certain aesthetic to maintain." Richard continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "And walking around in rags, harboring a junkyard eyesore in plain view, is a direct violation of our community guidelines. You're dragging down the property value of everyone on this street." The silence that followed stretched out thick and oppressive. Arthur didn't feel the need to explain that the flannel shirt he wore was more comfortable than any tailored silk, or that the dirt on his hands was the honest result of peaceful labor. The general had commanded hundreds of thousands of troops. He knew that the loudest man in the room was always the weakest. He remained perfectly silent, letting the heavy, suffocating weight of his presence press down on Richard's fragile shoulders, waiting for the petty tyrant to dig his grave just a little bit deeper. The silence that hung in the morning air wasn't empty. It was heavy, thick, and deeply oppressive. Arthur Sterling didn't feel the desperate urge to defend himself. He didn't feel the need to explain that the frayed flannel shirt he wore was infinitely more comfortable than any tailored silk suit, or that the dark dirt packed beneath his fingernails was the honest grounding result of peaceful labor. A man who had commanded hundreds of thousands of combat troops across multiple global theaters of war fundamentally understood one universal truth. The loudest man in the room was inevitably the weakest, so Arthur remained perfectly, terrifyingly silent. He let the suffocating weight of his sheer physical presence press down on Richard's fragile, inflated ego. Instead of raising his voice to match the Homeowners Association President's shrill, demanding frequency, Arthur calmly reached into the back pocket of his stained denim jeans. He withdrew a perfectly clean, neatly folded white cotton cloth. With agonizingly slow, deliberate movements, he began to wipe the rich potting soil from his massive, calloused fingers. He cleaned each knuckle with the exact meticulous precision a seasoned sniper utilizes to clear his rifle optics before a high-value mission. Throughout this entire deliberate process, Arthur didn't break eye contact once. His icy blue eyes remained fixed entirely on Richard, completely unblinking, tracking the younger man like a missile radar lock. The atmospheric pressure of Arthur's absolute stillness was overwhelming. It fundamentally disrupted Richard's practiced everyday bullying tactics. It forced Richard to unconsciously shift his weight backward. The thick polyurethane soles of his polished shoes letting out a pathetic, high-pitched squeak against the concrete driveway. Richard swallowed hard. A sudden, inexplicable knot formed tightly in his throat, a primal human instinct warning him of extreme immediate danger, but his bloated ego violently pushed that survival instinct down, forcing him to maintain his aggressive posture. He tapped his yellow plastic ruler rapidly against his heavy leather clipboard, a nervous, erratic twitch, attempting to break the suffocating tension. Arthur had faced down warlords who truly believed they were gods. He had negotiated with desperate insurgents holding hostages in crumbling desert compounds. This petty suburban dictator, waving a piece of yellow plastic, was nothing more than an insect buzzing near his ear. Finally, Arthur finished cleaning his hands. He folded the white cloth exactly into thirds, smoothing the sharp creases with his heavy thumb, and smoothly returned it to his pocket. Only then did he choose to speak. Mr. Vance Arthur said gently. His voice wasn't a shout. It contained no anger, no defensiveness, and no fear. It was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate directly through the concrete beneath their feet. It carried the quiet discipline of a man who had carried the weight of command through moments where one whispered coordinate could change an entire battlefield. I hear your concerns regarding the aesthetic guidelines of Shady Pines. Arthur continued, his tone perfectly flat. However, that vehicle is not scrap metal, and it's not moving. Richard let out a sharp, barking laugh of utter disbelief. He stepped closer, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just stepped perfectly into the striking range of a highly trained weapon. "Oh, it's moving!" "Old man," Richard sneered, waving his clipboard violently, inches from Arthur's scarred face. "This is my law. I decide what belongs here." Arthur took one single deliberate step forward. He didn't raise a finger. He just looked down at the yellow ruler in Richard's trembling hand. "You measure grass," Mr. Vance Arthur said quietly. "I highly suggest you stick to that, because you have absolutely no idea what you're looking at, and you don't want to tow that truck." The warning hung in the air, heavy and absolute, but Richard Vance was entirely incapable of processing it. To a man whose entire identity was built on the fragile foundation of neighborhood bylaws and the fear of his neighbors, Arthur's quiet defiance wasn't just an insult. It was an act of war. Richard's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. The veins in his neck bulged against the tight, uncomfortable collar of his cheap polyester shirt. He let out a sharp, breathless scoff, his narrow chest heaving as if he had just been physically struck by a heavy blow. "Is that a threat?" Richard shrieked, his voice cracking slightly as it reached an unnatural grating pitch. "Are you actually threatening the president of the Homeowners Association? You just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life, buddy." With a violent, jerky motion, Richard slammed his hand against the driver's side window of the Ford F-150. He plastered the massive bright orange violation sticker directly over the spiderweb cracks of the reinforced ballistic glass. He slapped it hard, smoothing down the edges with a frantic, manic energy to ensure the heavy adhesive would be nearly impossible to scrape off without leaving a horrific residue. But he didn't stop there. His hands were visibly shaking with a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and unchecked rage. Richard flipped his heavy leather clipboard to a fresh pad of pink citation forms. He began writing furiously, his pen tearing through the carbon copies with violent, jagged strokes. "Unauthorized vehicle on private property visible from the street," Richard muttered loudly, narrating his own petty tyranny so the old man could hear every single word. "Fine, $200. Maintaining a public nuisance, fine, $300. Failure to comply with an association officer, fine, $500. I will bankrupt you before lunch." Arthur watched the man throw his tantrum. He didn't step forward to intervene. He didn't shout to defend his property. His breathing remained at a perfectly steady rhythmic pace, exactly 12 breaths per minute. It was a biological anchor he had mastered during high-altitude sniper training decades ago. The sheer restraint Arthur exhibited in that driveway wasn't the paralysis of a frightened, powerless old man. It was the terrifying, calculated patience of an apex predator, allowing its prey to completely exhaust itself before moving in for the kill. Arthur turned slowly, his boots crunching softly on the driveway, and walked toward the cab of the battered truck. He pulled the heavy steel door open, the armored hinges groaning slightly under the weight, and reached deep into the glove compartment. He withdrew a folded piece of thick, high-quality watermarked parchment paper. It was an official, notarized letter from the Department of Defense, signed directly by the Secretary of the Army. The document explicitly detailed the vehicle's unique status as a protected historical artifact, granting it absolute immunity from all local municipal and private community ordinances. Arthur closed the heavy door and turned back to Richard, calmly extending the document. "Mr. Vance." Arthur said, his voice maintaining that low, even timbre that seemed to effortlessly absorb all the frantic, shrill noise Richard was producing. "Read this carefully. It's a federal exemption under the Military Heritage Act This specific vehicle is classified as protected government property. You're currently attempting to penalize a federal asset. You don't know what you're touching. Richard snatched the paper roughly from Arthur's massive hand, crumpling the pristine edge in his aggressive, sweaty grip. He didn't even bother to read the official government letterhead or look at the embossed golden seal at the bottom of the page. His eyes just scanned the first few bolded words before his lip curled into a sneer of supreme, blinding arrogance. He thought he had seen it all in this neighborhood. People faking disability placards, printing out fake service dog certificates just to bypass his rules. To Richard, this was just another pathetic civilian trying to scam his way out of a legitimate fine. A federal exemption. Richard barked, laughing harshly directly into Arthur's face. What is this absolute garbage? Did you print this out at the public library? You actually think a fake piece of paper gives you the right to turn my pristine neighborhood into a neglected junkyard? That document. Arthur said, his blue eyes narrowing by a fraction of a millimeter, the only visible sign that his patience was finally being tested is a direct federal order. I'm giving you one final opportunity to step away. Richard's fragile ego completely hijacked his brain. He gripped the top of the parchment with both hands. With a sharp, dramatic jerk, Richard ripped the official Department of Defense document straight down the middle. He tore it again, aggressively, reducing the notarized letter to worthless confetti, and threw the pieces onto the concrete right at Arthur's steel-toed boots. I don't care if you played soldier 50 years ago. Richard spat his voice, laced with pure venom. I don't care about your fake war stories, your forged papers, or your pathetic military cosplay. The military doesn't run Shady Pines. I do. And your little piece of trash truck is getting towed today. Arthur looked down at the torn pieces of the federal seal fluttering gently against the concrete. The silence that followed was no longer just heavy. It was deadly. You have no idea what you're touching, Arthur whispered. It wasn't a threat. It was a grim, factual statement. Richard had just crossed a line from annoying suburban nuisance to a direct threat against federal property. Arthur turned his back on the hyperventilating Homeowners Association. President dismissing him with the absolute finality of a judge passing sentence. He reached into the pocket of his frayed flannel shirt and pulled out a heavy black, heavily encrypted satellite phone. He didn't dial a number. He simply pressed a single red button on the side of the device. Hey, don't you turn your back on me. Richard screamed, his voice cracking, completely enraged by the sudden, absolute dismissal. He slapped his clipboard against his leg. I'm not finished with you. Arthur ignored him completely. He raised the heavy phone to his ear. The connection was instantaneous, bypassing all civilian networks, routing directly to a secure operations center deep beneath the Pentagon. Actual! This is Sierra 1. Arthur said, his voice crisp, devoid of the slow, patient cadence he had used moments before. This was the voice of a commander. I have a code blue violation at my primary residence. Local civilian attempting to illegally seize Asset Alpha. He has destroyed federal documentation and laid hands on my person. Richard froze. The confident sneer melted off his face, replaced by a sudden creeping confusion. He had expected the old man to yell to argue, maybe even throw a punch. He hadn't expected him to sound like he was calling in an airstrike. Sierra 1. Copy. A sharp, metallic voice replied through the earpiece, loud enough for Richard to catch the clinical, terrifying efficiency of the tone. Standby for escalation protocols. Negative. Arthur replied smoothly, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, looking straight through the manicured perfection of Shady Pines. No extreme force authorized at this time. Send the military police detachment from Fort Sheridan. Heavy transport. I want a full perimeter lockdown. Understood, Sierra 1. Military police detachment is scrambled. Estimated time of arrival is exactly 14 minutes. Arthur lowered the phone. He turned back to Richard. The Homeowners Association president was staring at him, his mouth slightly open, his mind desperately trying to categorize what he had just heard. It had to be a prank, a bluff, an elaborate piece of street theater. 14 minutes, Arthur said quietly, looking Richard dead in the eye. That's exactly how much time you have left to enjoy being the king of this street. Arthur looked down at the shredded pieces of the federal seal now scattered like snow across the pristine concrete of his driveway. The silence that followed the tearing of the paper was absolute, broken only by the ragged, wheezing gasps of Richard Vance. The Homeowners Association president was practically vibrating with adrenaline, his chest heaving under his cheap suit, his face flushed a dangerous blotchy purple. He had expected the old man to break. He got neither. Arthur's chest rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic cadence, 12 breaths a minute. It was a biological anchor, a meditative discipline forged in the fires of high-stress combat zones. His heart rate hadn't elevated a single beat. He didn't view Richard as an opponent. He viewed him as a minor administrative glitch that needed to be smoothly and efficiently corrected, without uttering a single word of protest, without showing even a flicker of the outrage Richard so desperately craved. Arthur simply turned his back. It was the ultimate dismissal. To a narcissist like Richard, being ignored was infinitely worse than being attacked. Hey, don't you turn your back on me. Richard shrieked, his voice cracking violently, reaching a pitch that startled a flock of birds out of a nearby oak tree. He threw his arms out wide, the heavy leather clipboard flapping wildly in his grip. I'm talking to you. I'm the president of this association. You don't walk away from me when I'm issuing a lawful directive. Arthur ignored the frantic squawking. He reached a thick, calloused hand deep into the front pocket of his stained denim jeans. He withdrew a device that looked entirely out of place in the manicured tranquility of Shady Pines. It wasn't a sleek, glass-backed smartphone. It was a heavy matte black satellite phone encased in military-grade, shock-absorbent rubber. Oh, what is this? Richard mocked, stepping aggressively toward Arthur's broad back, his squeaking shoes slapping the pavement. You're calling the cops. Go ahead. Call the local police department. The police chief plays golf with me every single Sunday. He knows exactly who I'm. You think they are going to side with a crazy old man harboring a junkyard truck over me? I'm the law in this neighborhood. Arthur didn't dial 911. He didn't need local law enforcement. He pressed a single recessed red button on the side of the heavy device. The connection bypassed all civilian networks, bouncing an encrypted signal off a Department of Defense satellite directly to a secure operations center deep within the Pentagon. Actual, this is Sierra 1. Arthur spoke into the receiver, His voice was a low resonant baritone, crisp and devoid of all emotion. It was the terrifying, authoritative voice of a commander delivering a situation report from a hostile theater. Behind him, Richard burst into a harsh, condescending laugh. Sierra 1, are you out of your mind? What are you playing walkie-talkies with your imaginary friends? You're pathetic. Arthur kept his eyes fixed calmly on the horizon, completely unbothered by the flailing civilian behind him. I have a situation at my primary residential coordinates, Arthur reported, his tone steady and flat. We have a Code Blue violation regarding Asset Alpha. A local civilian is currently attempting to illegally seize and impound the vehicle. Did you just call me a civilian? Richard screamed, stepping so close to Arthur's back that he could almost feel the heat radiating from the older man. He pointed his yellow plastic ruler like a dagger. I'm Richard Vance, and you're a lunatic. I'm calling my tow truck right now. Affirmative actual, Arthur continued, seamlessly ignoring the tantrum occurring inches from his spine. The individual has physically destroyed federal documentation and has made multiple verbal threats regarding the destruction of the asset. You really have no idea what you're touching. You're exactly right. I'm going to destroy it, Richard yelled wildly, waving his arms entirely blind to the catastrophic trap he was eagerly walking into. I'm going to have it crushed into a cube. Assess the threat level. Sierra 1. A sharp, metallic voice replied through the phone's earpiece, the audio crisp and clinical. Do you require immediate extraction? Is extreme force authorized? Negative on extreme force, Arthur replied calmly, his breathing still perfectly measured. It's a low-level security threat. The hostile is unarmed, just severely disoriented regarding his own authority. I don't require extraction. I require a containment protocol. Understood, Sierra? 1. The operator replied without hesitation. Initiating containment protocol. Assets are currently being scrambled to your coordinates. Maintain your position. Arthur slowly lowered the heavy black phone from his ear. And slid it back into the deep pocket of his stained jeans. He turned back to Richard. The Homeowners Association president was staring at him, his mouth slightly open, a fresh wave of aggressive confusion washing over his red face. Richard's mind simply refused to accept the reality of the situation. He had spent years meticulously cultivating a neighborhood where his clipboard was the highest authority. The idea that this old man in dirty clothes could bypass him with a single phone call wasn't just insulting. It was fundamentally impossible to his worldview. He convinced himself that Arthur was bluffing. It was a desperate, pathetic tactic to save a piece of junk. Who do you think you're kidding? Richard scoffed, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm, though it lacked the absolute certainty it had possessed a few minutes ago. You think you can just stand on my sidewalk, make a fake phone call to your imaginary military buddies, and I will just back down? You really are delusional. Richard took another step forward, violating Arthur's personal space once again, desperate to reclaim the physical dominance he felt slipping away. He pointed his finger directly at Arthur's chest. Let me make this perfectly clear for you, old man Richard, hissed his voice, trembling slightly with suppressed rage. This is my neighborhood. I enforce the rules. And your little charade didn't impress me. Arthur didn't blink. He looked at Richard with the same clinical detachment a scientist might use to observe a particularly annoying insect buzzing against a glass jar. You have exactly 24 hours. Richard declared, his voice rising in volume, attempting to project his authority to the surrounding houses, hoping an audience would validate his power. 24 hours to remove this unauthorized derelict vehicle from this property. If it's still sitting here tomorrow morning at exactly 8 in the morning, I will personally sign the authorization to have it towed by Nightshade Recovery. Richard paused, a cruel, triumphant smile stretching across his face. And let me tell you about Nightshade. They don't handle things gently. They will drag this rusted piece of garbage down the street, impound it in a lot you can't afford to access, and crush it into a perfectly neat, aesthetic little cube. Arthur stood motionless. The ticking clock had been set. The final ultimatum delivered, but Richard, in his blinding arrogance, had absolutely no idea that he had just handed the detonator to a 4-star general. I will not tell you again. Arthur said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried absolute finality. That vehicle is not moving, and if you attempt to touch it again, the consequences will be severe. Are you threatening me again? Richard shouted, his face turning an even deeper shade of crimson. That's it. Consider this your final official warning. 24 hours. Enjoy your last day with your trash. Richard spun sharply on his heel, his cheap shoes squeaking aggressively as he marched away down the pristine sidewalk. He walked with an exaggerated swagger, his chest puffed out, fully convinced he had just won a major victory. He believed he had put the defiant old man in his place and defended the honor of Shady Pines. Arthur watched him go. He didn't feel anger. He only felt a grim, profound sense of pity. Richard Vance thought he had just started a neighborhood dispute over a parked truck. He didn't know he had just declared war on the United States military. And he definitely didn't know that the clock wasn't ticking down to the destruction of the truck. It was ticking down to the absolute demolition of his entire life. By 4 in the afternoon that day, the atmosphere inside the Shady Pines Community Clubhouse was stifling. It wasn't just the heat of the unseasonably warm afternoon. It was the suffocating weight of mob mentality. Richard Vance had called an emergency meeting of the Homeowners Association, bypassing standard notice protocols to strike while his adrenaline was still high. He had spent the last several hours going door to door, whipping the residents into a frenzy of suburban paranoia. He painted Arthur not as a quiet retiree, but as a dangerous, unstable element threatening the very fabric of their safe community. The room was packed. Men in golf shirts and women in tennis skirts murmured nervously, casting sideways glances at the back row. There, sitting entirely alone on a folding metal chair, was Arthur Sterling. He hadn't changed his clothes. The dirt was still on the knees of his jeans. He didn't look angry or intimidated. He was sitting with his legs crossed, holding a small, weather-beaten leather notebook, calmly writing with a fountain pen. He looked less like a man on trial and more like an auditor taking a quiet inventory of a failing business. At the front of the room, standing behind a polished wooden podium that was entirely too large for him, Richard Vance was in his element. He had changed into a fresh suit and applied a new layer of hair gel. He tapped the microphone, the sharp feedback echoing through the silent room. "Ladies and gentlemen, neighbors." Richard began, his voice booming with forced theatrical gravity. "I called you here today because we are facing a crisis of community standards. We all moved to Shady Pines for a reason. For safety. For aesthetic harmony. For the guarantee that our property values would be fiercely protected. Richard paused, scanning the crowd to ensure they were hanging on his every word. They were. Today those standards were brutally assaulted. Richard continued, pointing dramatically toward the back of the room. The new resident at 42 Elm Street, Mr. Sterling, has decided that our rules don't apply to him. He's harboring a heavily damaged, unregistered, rusted-out piece of junk in his driveway. And when I approached him respectfully, as your elected representative to issue a standard compliance notice, he refused. He became uncooperative. He even produced a fabricated document to try and intimidate me. Gasps rippled through the audience. A few residents shook their heads in exaggerated disgust. Richard was playing them, perfectly feeding their inherent fear of anything outside their pristine, controlled environment. I will not be intimidated, Richard declared, his voice rising, slamming his fist onto the podium. We will not be bullied by someone who thinks they can turn our neighborhood into a salvage yard. The law of this association is clear. I have drafted an immediate compliance order. Mr. Sterling will sign this document legally, surrendering the vehicle to the association for immediate disposal. Or I will exercise my executive authority to have it forcibly removed by a private contractor within the hour. Richard held up a piece of paper, waving it like a flag of victory. And furthermore, we will be levying a $5,000 punitive fine for his aggressive insubordination. We must send a clear message that Shady Pines is not a dumping ground. The room erupted into scattered applause. The mob was fully behind their leader. They felt a collective surge of power, a shared righteousness in punishing the outsider. Richard stepped out from behind the podium, holding the compliance order and a pen. He walked down the center aisle, the crowd parting for him. He approached Arthur, a sickeningly sweet smile plastered across his face. This was the moment he had craved all day. Public humiliation, absolute submission. Well, Mr. Sterling, Richard sneered, thrusting the paper forward. The community has spoken. Sign the paper, give up the junk, or things get very, very expensive for you. Arthur didn't look up immediately. He carefully capped his fountain pen and closed his leather notebook. He placed them both in his breast pocket. He slowly raised his icy blue eyes, looking past Richard, scanning the faces of the crowd. He saw the judgment, the arrogance, the blind adherence to a petty tyrant. He felt a deep, profound disappointment. "I'm not signing anything," Mr. Vance Arthur said. His voice wasn't amplified by a microphone, but it resonated clearly into every corner of the silent room. "And I strongly advise you for the final time to reconsider this course of action." "You don't advise me of anything," Richard shouted, his face instantly turning purple. The public defiance was intolerable. He threw the compliance order onto the floor at Arthur's feet. "You're done. You hear me. You're finished. I'm calling the tow trucks right now. You can watch your precious garbage get crushed." Arthur leaned back slightly in his folding chair. He looked at Richard, his expression entirely devoid of anger. "You're a very small man," Richard Arthur said quietly, the words cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "And you're about to make a very large mistake." Arthur slowly lowered his gaze, scanning the crowded room. He saw the judgment, the arrogance, the blind, eager adherence to a petty tyrant. He felt a deep, profound disappointment in the men and women sitting before him. They were so easily led, so willing to destroy a man they didn't even know, simply because he didn't fit their narrow, perfectly manicured aesthetic. Arthur didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice to match Richard's frantic shouting. He simply reached up with a calloused hand and slowly, deliberately removed his reading glasses. He folded the earpieces with a soft click and placed them on the metal chair beside him. It was a microscopic shift in body language, but the effect was immediate and terrifying. The slight scholarly air vanished instantly. Without the glasses, his icy blue eyes were entirely unobstructed. They were the eyes of a predator that had just stopped playing with its food. He looked directly at Richard Vance. Arthur didn't see a powerful homeowners association president. He didn't see a community leader. He looked at Richard with the exact same dead clinical calculation of a combat engineer staring down at a poorly constructed, highly volatile, improvised explosive device that he was about to safely detonate. "I'm not signing anything," Mr. Vance Arthur said. His voice was entirely unamplified by any microphone, yet the low, resonant baritone cut through the thick tension of the room like a combat blade. It was a voice that commanded immediate, absolute silence. The murmuring in the back rows died instantly. "And I strongly advise you, for the final time, to carefully reconsider the path you're choosing to walk down." Richard's face, already red from his performance, instantly turned a violent mottled shade of purple. The public defiance was intolerable. It was a direct strike at the very core of his fragile identity. "You don't advise me of anything," Richard shrieked, spittle flying from his lips as he slammed both fists onto the podium. He snatched the compliance order and threw it aggressively onto the floor right at Arthur's boots. "You're done. Do you hear me? You're finished in this neighborhood. I'm calling the tow trucks right now. You can sit there and watch your precious garbage get crushed into a cube." Arthur leaned back slightly into his folding chair, his posture relaxing into a terrifying stillness. He looked at the screaming man on the stage, his expression entirely devoid of anger, fear, or even basic human concern. "You're a very small man," Richard Arthur said quietly, the words dropping like heavy stones into the silent room, "and you're about to make a very large mistake." Richard let out a hysterical bark of laughter, turning to the crowd with his arms spread wide, inviting them to share in the mockery. "A mistake. You think I'm making a mistake? I have the full backing of the Shady Pines Board. I have the bylaws. I have the power." He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, waving it like a weapon. "I'm calling Nightshade Recovery. They will be here in 45 minutes. Your little junkyard experiment is over." Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't try to stop him. He just watched Richard dial the number. A grim, humorless smile finally touching the corners of his scarred mouth. The trap was set. The bait was taken. The countdown had officially begun. And Richard Vance, blinded by his own pathetic ego, had absolutely no idea that he had just signed his own professional and financial downfall. The silence in the clubhouse was momentarily broken by a low collective murmur from the residents. They shifted uncomfortably in their plastic chairs. Arthur's quiet defiance wasn't just annoying, it was fundamentally confusing. They were used to seeing people crumble under Richard's relentless bureaucratic pressure. But Arthur wasn't crumbling. He was observing. He was calculating. Richard, however, was incapable of reading the room. He mistook the crowd's unease for anticipation. He thought they were waiting for the final execution. He marched back to the oversized podium, his chest puffed out so far it strained the buttons of his cheap suit jacket. "Mr. Sterling believes he's above the rules," Richard sneered, grabbing the microphone with both hands. "He believes that because he's older, or because he claims some fake military background, that he doesn't have to contribute to the financial health of Shady Pines." Richard leaned heavily against the podium, a sly conspiratorial grin spreading across his face. He felt invincible. He felt like the ultimate protector of suburban wealth. "Now we all know how expensive property maintenance can be." Richard continued his voice, taking on a slimy salesman-like quality. "And removing a heavy derelict vehicle requires specialized equipment. It requires professionals. That's why, as your president, I have negotiated a highly exclusive expedited contract with Nightshade Recovery Services." Arthur's eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. He had heard the name Nightshade Recovery before. It wasn't a reputable municipal service. It was a notoriously aggressive, predatory towing company that operated on the extreme fringes of the law, known for price gouging and physically damaging the vehicles they seized. They are the best in the business. Richard boasted, completely unaware that he was loudly confessing to a massive conflict of interest in front of a federal officer. "And because I have a close personal working relationship with their regional manager, my cousin actually, they have agreed to handle all Shady Pines removals at a significantly accelerated rate. We call they hook, and the problem disappears." Arthur slowly reached into his breast pocket and retrieved his leather notebook and fountain pen. He flipped to a fresh page and began to write. The scratching of the nib against the paper was exceptionally loud in the quiet room. "Are you taking notes, old man?" Richard mocked from the stage, pointing a finger at him. "Are you writing down my cousin's name so you know who to write the check to? Because the impound fees are going to be astronomical. $200 a day for storage, plus the initial hook fee, plus the administrative penalty from the Homeowners Association." Richard laughed, a harsh, greedy sound that echoed off the cheap acoustic tiles. "By the time you get that rusted trash back, you could have bought a new car. Or you can just sign the compliance order right now, surrender the title to the association, and we will have Nightshade scrap it for parts. We will even waive the $5,000 fine. Consider it a neighborly discount." Arthur finished writing. He capped his pen with a sharp, decisive click. He didn't look at Richard. He looked at the notebook, his voice perfectly steady, reciting his notes aloud, as if dictating an official incident report. "Admission of direct nepotism in the awarding of private community contracts." Arthur stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "Collusion with a known predatory towing service. Attempted extortion of a civilian resident under the guise of municipal authority. And premeditated intent to illegally seize and destroy federal property." Arthur closed the notebook and finally looked up at Richard. "You're not just a bully, Mr. Vance," Arthur said coldly. "You're running an illegal extortion racket, and you just confessed to it in front of 50 witnesses." The color rapidly drained from Richard's face, leaving him a pale, sickly gray. For a split second, a flash of genuine panic crossed his eyes. The old man wasn't just crazy. He was systematically dismantling Richard's entire operation with clinical precision. But the panic was quickly swallowed by a massive wave of defensive rage. Richard slammed his fist onto the podium so hard the microphone squealed. "Be quiet!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking violently. You don't know anything. You're a nobody. I'm calling Nightshade right now. We will see how tough you sound when that piece of junk is dangling from a steel hook." Richard didn't just slam his fist on the podium. He brought both hands down with a resounding, violent crash that rattled the cheap microphone and sent a physical shockwave of nervous energy through the seated residents. His face was no longer just flushed. It was a terrifying mottled mask of absolute unhinged fury. The old man's calm surgical dissection of his highly profitable towing operation hadn't just insulted him. It had struck the very core of his fragile, deeply corrupt little empire. And Richard Vance responded the only way a cornered tyrant knew how. He doubled down with blinding arrogance. "This meeting is officially brought to a vote." Richard screamed, his voice reaching a pitch so shrill it cracked over the speakers. He wasn't asking the board of directors. He was dictating to them. He grabbed the compliance order he had just thrown on the floor, snatching it up with trembling fingers and slapping it back onto the wooden podium. "By the power vested in me as the Supreme President of the Shady Pines Homeowners Association, I'm invoking the Emergency Hazard Clause. Article 7, Section 3. Immediate removal of a catastrophic neighborhood blight." He looked out at the crowd, his eyes wide and manic. The residents who only moments ago had been cheering for Arthur's humiliation were now shifting very uncomfortably in their folding chairs. A few of the more perceptive neighbors had noticed the absolute chilling lack of fear in Arthur's icy blue eyes. They had heard the precise legal terminology the old man had used and the very real mention of extortion. The mob mentality was beginning to fracture, replaced by a sudden creeping doubt, but Richard refused to let his power slip away. He needed absolute compliance, all in favor of immediate confiscation and total destruction of the unauthorized vehicle at 42 Elm Street, say I. Richard demanded, glaring furiously at the front row, daring anyone to defy him. A scattered, weak chorus of eyes murmured nervously through the room. It wasn't the roaring, unified approval Richard desperately wanted, but it was enough. It was all the paper-thin legal cover his twisted mind required. "The motion carries unanimously," Richard declared. He grabbed a cheap wooden gavel and slammed it onto the podium for theatrical effect. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. He pulled a gold-plated pen from his breast pocket and signed the bottom of the compliance order with an aggressive slashing flourish. Without missing a beat, Richard pulled his cell phone from his pocket. His hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device. He dialed the number from memory, putting the phone on maximum speaker volume and holding it directly up to the microphone so the entire room could hear his ultimate triumph. The line rang twice before a gruff, gravelly voice answered. "Nightshade Recovery. We hook it, you book it." "Vinny, it's Richard, the Homeowners Association." "President," barked a manic, triumphant grin, spreading across his face as he stared down at Arthur. "I need your heavy-duty rig at 42 Elm Street immediately. We have a highly non-compliant resident harboring a massive rusted-out Ford truck. It's an emergency removal, full impound. And Vinny, tell the boys they don't need to be gentle with the axles on this one. Drag it if you have to. It's going straight to the crusher anyway." "Copy that, Ricky." The voice crackled loudly over the clubhouse speakers. "We have got a rig finishing up a job in the area right now. Be there in under an hour. Just have the authorization paperwork signed and ready for the driver." Richard ended the call with a vicious, satisfied jab of his thumb. He looked down at Arthur, his chest heaving rapidly, his ego fully inflated to its absolute maximum capacity. He felt like a conqueror standing over a defeated enemy. He had used the system. He had executed his power. He had won. "Did you hear that, Mr. Sterling?" Richard sneered, stepping down from the podium and walking slowly toward the back of the room, relishing every single second of his perceived victory. The wheels are in motion. The heavy machinery is on its way. You thought you could come into my neighborhood, quote some fake laws, and disrespect me in front of my people. You're nothing. Arthur didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice to defend himself. He simply raised his left arm and calmly checked the heavy tactical military watch strapped tightly to his thick wrist. The hands on the dial moved with the exact same relentless, unstoppable precision as the man wearing it. He lowered his arm and looked back up at Richard. The absolute lack of emotion in Arthur's eyes was infinitely more terrifying than any scream or physical threat could ever be. "It's currently 4:20 in the afternoon," Mr. Vance Arthur said. His voice was a calm, steady rumble, completely unaffected by the hysterical circus that had just unfolded around him. "Your towing company stated they would arrive in under an hour." Arthur slowly leaned forward in his metal chair, resting his massive calloused forearms heavily on his knees. "You have exactly 45 minutes. Arthur whispered his words, slicing flawlessly through the dead silence of the clubhouse. 45 minutes before you, your cousin, and every single person on this board who just voted yes commit a Class A federal felony. I strongly suggest you spend that time calling a very good lawyer. At exactly 4:58 in the afternoon, the quiet, pristine street of Elm was shattered by the brutal, roaring diesel engine of a heavy-duty tow truck. The massive vehicle painted a sinister matte black with the words Nightshade Recovery stenciled in sharp crimson letters on the door, aggressively jumped the curb, its heavy tires tearing deep, ugly trenches into the perfectly manicured grass of the adjacent lawn. Richard Vance stood on the sidewalk, his hands on his hips, a manic, triumphant grin plastered across his face. He watched with undisguised glee as the massive truck backed up to Arthur's driveway, its reverse alarm beeping with a harsh, mocking cadence. A few neighbors had crept out of their houses, standing on their porches, watching the spectacle with a mixture of morbid curiosity and nervous dread. The driver of the tow truck, a hulking man wearing a grease-stained t-shirt and heavily tattooed arms, hopped out of the cab. He didn't look at Arthur. He looked at Richard, flashing a gold-toothed smile. "This the garbage you need. Hold off." Ricky the driver yelled over the roar of the idling engine, pulling a pair of heavy leather work gloves from his back pocket. "That's the one," Vinnie Richard shouted back, pointing his yellow plastic ruler at the rusted Ford F-150, like a commanding general ordering an artillery strike. "And remember what I said. Don't worry about scratching the paint. It's going straight into the crusher. I want this eyesore gone before dinner time." Vinnie laughed a harsh, guttural sound and walked to the back of his rig. He grabbed a massive steel J-hook attached to a thick braided metal winch cable. The chain clanked heavily against the steel bed of the tow truck. It was a brutal industrial sound that signaled the absolute destruction of property. Arthur Sterling stood on his porch. He had finally changed out of his gardening clothes. He was now wearing a crisp, dark navy sweater and tailored khaki trousers. He looked entirely calm, holding a ceramic mug of steaming black coffee. He didn't shout. He didn't run down the steps to physically stop the driver. He simply took a slow, deliberate sip from his mug, his icy blue eyes fixed firmly on the sky above the tree line. Vinny dragged the heavy steel cable down the driveway. He crouched down carelessly, kicking the front tire of the historic Ford, and aggressively jammed the thick steel J-hook underneath the front bumper, searching for a solid anchor point on the chassis. The horrific metallic scrape of steel grinding against steel echoed loudly down the quiet suburban street. It was the sound of a red line being crossed. "Hooked up and ready to pull," Vinny shouted, slapping the hood of the truck and turning back toward the controls of his rig. Richard Vance threw his head back and laughed a loud, obnoxious sound of total victory. He looked up at Arthur on the porch, spreading his arms wide. "I told you," Richard gloated, his voice dripping with pure arrogance. "I told you I run this neighborhood. Say goodbye to your trash old man." Richard was so entirely consumed by his own petty triumph, so completely focused on the rusted truck in front of him, that he didn't feel the sudden, massive shift in the atmospheric pressure. He didn't notice the sudden, violent rustling of the leaves in the oak trees. But then the sound hit them. It wasn't a siren. It was a deep, rhythmic, thudding vibration that seemed to shake the very concrete beneath their feet. It was a sound that Arthur Sterling knew intimately. It was the sound of overwhelming, absolute force. Suddenly, the pale afternoon sun was blocked out. A massive, terrifying shadow swept rapidly across the perfectly manicured lawns of shady pines. Richard looked up, his triumphant smile freezing instantly on his face. Hovering less than 200 feet above the street, the violent downdraft from its twin rotors flattening the expensive flower beds and sending trash cans spinning wildly down the road, was a heavily modified Sikorsky Blackhawk helicopter. It was painted a matte radar, absorbing black bearing, no civilian markings, only a stark, menacing United States military insignia. Before Richard's brain could even begin to process the impossible sight above him, the street level erupted into absolute chaos. Tires screeched violently at both ends of Elm Street. 6 massive black armored Chevrolet Suburbans, their grills heavily reinforced with steel push bars, slammed into the neighborhood. They didn't park politely at the curb. They swerved aggressively, cutting off all avenues of escape, effectively boxing in the tow truck. And Richard Vance in a flawless, militarized blockade. The doors of the Suburbans flew open simultaneously. It was a terrifying display of synchronized aggression. Over 24 men poured out into the street. They weren't local police officers. They weren't mall security. They were towering figures dressed in full tactical combat gear, heavily armed with service rifles slung tight across their chests, wearing Kevlar helmets and dark ballistic sunglasses. Emblazoned across the back of their heavy tactical vests in stark block letters were the words "Military Police," and mingled among them several agents wearing the unmistakable dark windbreakers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Hands in the air. Don't move," a voice boomed, not from a man, but from a high-powered long-range acoustic device mounted to the roof of the lead sport utility vehicle. The sheer volume of the command was physically painful, a wall of sound designed to instantly paralyze. "Vinny!" The tow truck driver dropped the winch remote as if it were coated in acid. He immediately threw his hands so high in the air, his grease-stained shirt tore at the seams. He fell to his knees on the concrete, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. Richard Vance stood frozen in the center of the driveway. His yellow plastic ruler slipped from his trembling fingers, bouncing pathetically against the pavement. His heart hammered wildly against his ribs, a cold, sickening dread pooling rapidly in his stomach. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was an invasion. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out of the lead Suburban. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He wore a razor-sharp, perfectly pressed Army service uniform. Silver eagles glinted brightly on his collar. He ignored the terrified tow truck driver. He ignored the sobbing homeowners association president. He walked with crisp, urgent strides directly past them, his boots striking the pavement with absolute authority. The colonel stopped at the edge of the porch. He snapped to attention, his body locking into a posture of rigid, flawless military discipline. He brought his right hand up in a razor-sharp salute. "General Sterling, sir." The colonel's voice rang out loud and clear, carrying effortlessly over the hum of the idling armored vehicles and the distant thud of the hovering Black Hawk. "The perimeter is secure. Asset Alpha is undamaged. Awaiting your orders, sir." Richard Vance's knees finally buckled. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him a ghastly, translucent white. He looked from the heavily armed tactical teams to the hovering military helicopter, and finally to the quiet old man standing on the porch, the man he had just threatened to bankrupt, the man whose property he had just ordered destroyed. Arthur Sterling took one final slow sip of his black coffee. He returned the salute with a casual, terrifying grace. "Stand down," Colonel Arthur said quietly, looking directly at the trembling Homeowners Association president. "But please process the civilians. They are trespassing on a federal site." Richard Vance stood with his arms spread wide, his chest heaving with the absolute intoxicating thrill of total victory. He threw his head back and let out a loud, obnoxious laugh that echoed against the pristine facades of the multi-million-dollar homes. He had won. The heavy steel J-hook of the Nightshade Recovery tow truck was firmly secured to the undercarriage of the rusted 1970 Ford F-150. Vinny, the heavily tattooed driver, stood at the hydraulic control panel, his hand resting casually on the main lever, waiting for the final command to rip the historic vehicle from its resting place. Richard looked up at the porch, expecting to see Arthur Sterling finally break. He wanted to see the old man beg, but Arthur didn't beg. He didn't move. He stood perfectly still, holding his ceramic mug of black coffee, his icy blue eyes completely ignoring Richard, and staring intently at the sky just beyond the neighborhood's dense tree line. "Pull it!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with manic glee. "Drag that piece of garbage right down the street." Vinny grinned, his gold tooth catching the pale afternoon light, and pulled the hydraulic lever backward. The heavy diesel engine of the tow truck roared in protest as the thick braided steel cable pulled completely taut. The metal groaned, but the historic truck didn't move an inch. And then the atmospheric pressure in the cul-de-sac fundamentally changed. It didn't begin with a siren. It began with a deep, rhythmic, bone-rattling vibration that seemed to violently shake the concrete directly beneath their feet. It was a heavy thudding pulse that resonated in the chest cavity, a sound that Arthur Sterling knew intimately from 100 different combat drops in hostile countries. It was the undeniable sound of overwhelming, absolute force. Richard blinked, the triumphant smile freezing instantly on his face. The pale afternoon sun was suddenly and violently blocked out. A massive, terrifying shadow swept rapidly across the perfectly manicured lawns of shady pines, plunging the immediate area into an eerie, unnatural twilight. Richard looked up, his jaw dropping open. Hovering less than 200 feet above the street, descending with terrifying speed, was a heavily modified Sikorsky Black Hawk helicopter. It was painted a flat radar, absorbing matte black bearing, absolutely no civilian markings. The only identifying feature was a stark, menacing United States military insignia stenciled on its side. The violent cyclonic downdraft from its twin rotors hit the street like a localized hurricane. Expensive, meticulously arranged flower beds were instantly flattened. Decorative lawn ornaments were ripped from the soil and sent spinning wildly down the asphalt. The deafening wash of the Black Hawk tore at Richard's cheap polyester suit, whipping his tie wildly around his neck. The sheer punishing roar of the helicopter's engines completely drowned out the pathetic idling of the tow truck. Before Richard's terrified brain could even begin to process the impossible cinematic nightmare unfolding directly above his head, the street level erupted into absolute coordinated chaos. The shrieking of tortured rubber tore through the neighborhood. From both ends of Elm Street, a convoy of 6 massive black armored Chevrolet Suburbans, their grills heavily reinforced with aggressive steel push bars, slammed into the cul-de-sac. They didn't park politely at the curb. They swerved violently, their heavy tires jumping the pristine sidewalks and tearing deep, ugly trenches into the immaculate grass. They executed a flawless, militarized blockade, completely cutting off all avenues of escape and perfectly boxing in the tow truck and the paralyzed Homeowners Association president. The heavy armored doors of the Suburbans flew open simultaneously. It was a terrifying, overwhelming display of synchronized tactical aggression. Over 24 towering figures poured out into the street. They weren't the local neighborhood watch. They were highly trained operators dressed in full combat gear. They wore heavy Kevlar helmets, dark ballistic sunglasses, and thick tactical vests. They moved with terrifying speed, service rifles slung tight across their chests. Their heavy military boots slamming against the pavement in a rhythmic, deafening march. Laser sights danced across the side of the tow truck as the operators fanned out with ruthless efficiency, establishing a hardened perimeter. Emblazoned across the back of their vests, in stark, white, block letters, were the words military police, and mingling seamlessly among them were several agents wearing the unmistakable dark windbreakers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In exactly 3 minutes, the quiet elite suburban enclave of Shady Pines had been transformed into an active military containment zone. Kill the engine. Step away from the controls. Put your hands in the air immediately. A voice boomed not from a man shouting, but from a high-powered long-range acoustic device mounted to the roof of the lead armored sport utility vehicle. The sheer volume of the command was a physical wall of sound designed to instantly disorient and paralyze. Vinny, the arrogant tow truck driver who had been laughing just seconds ago, let go of the hydraulic lever as if it were coated in molten lava. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He threw his hands so high into the air that the seams of his grease-stained shirt tore violently. He dropped to his knees on the rough concrete, pressing his face toward the ground, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. Richard Vance stood completely frozen in the center of the driveway. The yellow plastic ruler he used to measure grass slipped from his trembling, sweaty fingers, bouncing pathetically against the pavement. The heavy leather clipboard full of neighborhood bylaws tumbled from his grip, his knees knocked together completely, losing their structural integrity. The invincible king of Shady Pines was suddenly struggling just to remain standing, utterly surrounded by a heavily armed federal strike force that had descended from the sky to turn his life into a living nightmare. The commanding officer of the military police detachment didn't sprint up the driveway. He didn't unholster his weapon or scream redundant orders. He simply strode forward with the terrifying absolute precision of a man who commanded an overwhelming tactical advantage. He was a full colonel, his heavily starched Army service uniform standing in stark contrast to the thick matte black tactical gear of the operators fanning out flawlessly around him. He stopped precisely 3 feet from the edge of the porch, entirely ignoring Richard Vance, who was currently trembling so violently he looked like he might vibrate completely out of his cheap polyester suit. The colonel snapped his heels together. The sharp, decisive crack of his polished leather boots against the concrete echoed loudly through the sudden stunned silence of the neighborhood. He brought his right hand up in a rigid razor-sharp salute, holding it perfectly still. "General Sterling, sir." The colonel's voice boomed. It wasn't a shout. It was a perfectly calibrated projection of absolute military respect, carrying effortlessly over the heavy rhythmic thudding of the Black Hawk still hovering menacingly above the tree line. The perimeter is entirely secure. Asset Alpha remains undamaged, awaiting your further orders, sir. Richard Vance stopped breathing. The oxygen seemed to completely, instantly vaporize from his lungs. The blood drained so rapidly from his face that his skin took on a sickening, translucent gray pallor. His brain entirely programmed to process petty neighborhood squabbles and minor aesthetic infractions completely short-circuited. He stared blankly at the colonel. Then he slowly, painfully turned his head to look at the man standing on the porch. The man he had called a nobody. The man he had aggressively mocked. The man whose property he had just legally ordered a predatory towing company to physically destroy. Arthur Sterling hadn't moved. He hadn't flinched when the heavily armored Suburbans tore up his lawn. He hadn't blinked when the Black Hawk cast its massive shadow over his house. He simply stood there, holding his ceramic mug of black coffee, radiating a quiet, absolute authority that made Richard's entire existence feel entirely insignificant. Arthur slowly, deliberately returned the salute. It was a casual gesture, but it carried the terrifying weight of 4 decades of absolute command. "Stand down," Colonel Arthur said quietly. His voice didn't need to boom. It was the only sound that mattered. The immediate threat has been neutralized. But please process these 2 civilians. They are currently trespassing on a highly classified, federally protected site. Richard's mouth opened and closed several times, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked like a fish violently pulled from the water, suffocating under the crushing pressure of a reality he couldn't possibly comprehend. He slowly looked down at his own hands, the hands that had so arrogantly signed the compliance order. the hands that had physically torn a notarized Department of Defense document into tiny, worthless pieces. General Richard finally managed to whisper. The word tasted like ash in his dry mouth. It was a pathetic, broken sound, entirely stripped of the shrill, demanding arrogance he had wielded like a weapon just 3 minutes prior. Arthur finally lowered his coffee mug and looked directly at Richard. The icy blue eyes were no longer just observant. They were surgical. They systematically dismantled Richard Vance piece by piece, exposing the terrified, hollow little bully hiding underneath the cheap suit and the pathetic yellow plastic ruler. "I told you, Richard," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, unforgiving rumble that sent a physical shiver directly down Richard's spine. "You were measuring grass, and you had absolutely no idea what you were touching." 2 towering military police operators stepped smoothly forward, their heavily armored tactical boots crunching loudly on the concrete. They didn't read Richard his Miranda rights. They didn't ask for his side of the story. They simply grabbed him by the arms with a terrifying bruising strength that instantly conveyed the absolute futility of resistance. "Wait!" Richard gasped, his voice breaking into a high-pitched, desperate squeal as the operators effortlessly spun him around. "Wait, this is a misunderstanding. I'm the president of the Homeowners Association. I have the bylaws. I have the paperwork." "The paperwork you destroyed was a federal mandate," Mr. Vance, the colonel, said, coldly stepping closer, his eyes narrowing in absolute disgust. "You're currently under arrest for the attempted destruction of classified government property, criminal extortion, and the direct physical harassment of a 4-star general. You don't need a neighborhood bylaw right now, sir. You need a miracle." The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Richard's wrists echoed loudly in the driveway. It was the exact same harsh, unforgiving sound as the tow truck's winch. But this time, Richard Vance was the one being dragged away. The cold, heavy steel of the military-issue handcuffs bit sharply into Richard Vance's wrists, pinning his arms awkwardly behind his back. It was a stark, unforgiving physical reality that his arrogant, suburban, programmed brain was still fiercely rejecting. 2 towering military police operators held him firmly by the biceps. Their grip was like industrial machinery, completely immobilizing him, their dark, Kevlar tactical vests pressing roughly against the cheap, wrinkling fabric of his polyester suit. He was no longer the supreme, unquestioned ruler of the Shady Pines Homeowners Association. He was a neutralized federal suspect, completely powerless, surrounded by the overwhelming scent of aviation fuel from the Black Hawk helicopter still circling methodically overhead. The colonel stepped smoothly forward, pulling a ruggedized digital tablet from his chest rig. He didn't look at Richard with anger. He looked at him with the cold, bureaucratic disgust reserved for a remarkably foolish criminal. "Richard Vance." The colonel's voice echoed across the quiet cul-de-sac, devoid of any emotion, delivering the words with surgical, terrifying precision. "You're being placed under federal arrest. You're hereby charged with direct violations of Title 18 United States Code Section 1361, willful depredation of property of the United States government." Richard gasped, his chest heaving in rapid, shallow spasms. "Property," he wheezed, his voice reduced to a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "It's a rusted truck. It violates the neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. I have the paperwork. The colonel didn't even blink. That vehicle is a decommissioned combat asset permanently protected under the National Military Heritage Act. It's classified as an irreplaceable historical artifact. Furthermore, you're being charged under Section 111, the assault attempted extortion and harassment of a high-ranking commissioned officer of the United States Armed Forces. The colonel leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing behind his ballistic sunglasses. That charge alone carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. You're not going to a local precinct, Mr. Vance. You're going to a federal holding facility. 10 feet away, the situation was unfolding with equal brutality for the arrogant tow truck driver. Vinny was hauled violently up from the concrete by two grim-faced agents wearing dark Federal Bureau of Investigation windbreakers. His grease-stained shirt was torn at the shoulder. His earlier bravado completely evaporated into thin air. As the federal agents ratcheted thick heavy-duty plastic zip ties around his massive wrists, Vinny instantly turned on his employer. The corrupt little alliance they had built to terrorize the neighborhood crumbled the absolute second real, unavoidable consequences arrived. It was him, Vinny screamed, his voice cracking with absolute terror. He violently jerked his head toward Richard, desperately trying to save his own skin. Ricky told me to do it. He said the Homeowners Association board cleared it. He told me to drag the truck down the street and crush it into a cube. I didn't know it was a protected government vehicle. I'm just a driver. He set me up. I was just following his official orders. The betrayal hit Richard like a physical blow to the stomach. He looked frantically toward the sidewalks, desperately seeking any lifeline. Dozens of Shady Pines residents had stepped out of their pristine, identical homes, drawn by the roaring engines and the shouting. The very people Richard had aggressively fined, bullied, and belittled for years were now standing on their porches, watching his spectacular downfall. "Help me, Richard," pleaded, twisting his neck to look at the crowd. "Jenkins, Susan, tell them I'm the president of this association. I was just enforcing our bylaws. Tell them I'm in charge." The silence from the neighbors was absolutely deafening. Nobody moved to defend him. Jenkins the man, Richard had smugly fined a $150 earlier that exact morning because his grass was 3/8 of an inch too high, stood on his porch with his arms crossed. A look of profound, deeply satisfying vindication washed over Jenkins's face. Susan, who had been forced to repaint her front door 3 separate times to meet Richard's insane, hyper-specific color palette, actually pulled out her smartphone to record the arrest in high definition. There was no sympathy to be found. There was only the cold, hard delivery of instant karma. "Move!" The operator, holding Richard's left arm, commanded, his voice muffled heavily behind a dark fire-resistant balaclava. The operator shoved Richard forward. He stumbled his over-polished shoes, scuffing awkwardly against the pavement, completely stripped of his arrogant swagger. They marched him aggressively toward the rear of the lead armored Chevrolet Suburban. Richard twisted his head, desperately looking back at the porch one last time. General Arthur Sterling wasn't gloating. He wasn't smiling. He was simply standing there, exactly as he had been since the morning began, a stoic, immovable mountain of discipline. Arthur slowly raised his ceramic mug, taking a quiet sip of black coffee, dismissing Richard from his reality entirely. The operator shoved Richard roughly into the back of the tactical vehicle. The heavy ballistic-rated steel door slammed shut behind him with a deafening, absolute finality. The echoing boom of that closing door was the unmistakable sound of a petty tyrant's entire empire collapsing into dust. The arrest in the driveway was merely the opening salvo. When the United States federal government decides to dismantle a man's life, it doesn't do so with loud, chaotic bravado. It executes the task with a cold, terrifying, and ruthlessly systematic efficiency. The armored Chevrolet Suburbans didn't just haul Richard Vance away and quietly return to base. A secondary team of Federal Bureau of Investigation forensic accountants, clad in stark dark windbreakers, immediately breached the front door of Richard's meticulously beige-painted house on Elm Street. They weren't looking for the historic truck. They were executing a sweeping federally mandated search warrant. The agents moved through the pristine suburban home like surgical instruments. They seized his polished desktop computer, his meticulously organized leather-bound ledgers, his encrypted hard drives, and every digital storage device they could locate. The carefully constructed facade of the righteous law-abiding Homeowners Association, President, crumbled in exactly 42 minutes of deep forensic data extraction. Richard Vance wasn't just a petty neighborhood tyrant who enjoyed measuring grass. He was a prolific, highly organized thief. The decrypted ledgers revealed a massive systematic embezzlement operation that had been running unchecked for nearly a half-decade. Richard had been quietly siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from the Shady Pines Community Reserve Fund. The highly exclusive contracts he constantly boasted about to the residents. They were nothing but a thinly veiled vehicle for illicit financial kickbacks. Every single time Nightshade Recovery illegally towed a neighbor's car for a minor parking infraction, a generous, untraceable percentage of those exorbitant impound fees was wired directly into a hidden, offshore shell account held exclusively under Richard's name. He had financed his cheap suits, his overly polished shoes, and his inflated lifestyle entirely on the stolen wealth of the very people he claimed to protect. 30 miles away, the reality of his situation was finally crashing down on Richard inside a federal holding facility. The room was cold, entirely windowless, and smelled faintly of industrial bleach and absolute despair. Richard sat violently shivering in a bright orange Department of Corrections jumpsuit that fit him far worse than his polyester suits ever had. The arrogant chest-puffing swagger was completely erased. Across the scarred stainless steel table sat a senior special agent who casually dropped a thick, devastatingly heavy manila file onto the reflective surface. The federal agent didn't yell. He delivered the facts with the cold precision of a judge reading a final sentence. Wire fraud, grand larceny, racketeering, criminal extortion, attempted destruction of classified government property, and the direct physical assault of a 4-star military officer. The agent ticked the horrific charges off on his fingers, his voice devoid of any human sympathy. The federal prosecutor was seeking a minimum of 15 years in a maximum security penitentiary without the absolute possibility of early parole. But the hammer blows of ruin didn't stop at criminal charges. All of Richard's financial assets, including the hidden offshore accounts, had been permanently frozen under the Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act. His bank balances were instantly zeroed out. A sharp-suited attorney walked into the interrogation room, but it wasn't a high-priced defense lawyer coming to save him. It was his wife's attorney who callously tossed a sealed envelope onto his manacled lap. Divorce papers. She was citing his immediate federal incarceration and the complete forfeiture of their marital assets. The bank was already initiating rapid foreclosure proceedings on the immaculate house on Elm Street. Richard Vance had literally lost his kingdom, his stolen wealth, his marriage, and his freedom in a span of less than 6 hours. He buried his pale face in his chained hands and wept a hollow, pathetic sound that echoed uselessly in the sterile room. Back at the Shady Pines cul-de-sac, the harsh afternoon sun had finally begun to mellow, casting long, peaceful golden shadows across the immaculate lawns. The armored tactical vehicles were gone. The Black Hawk had long since vanished beyond the horizon. The street was incredibly profoundly quiet. Arthur Sterling stood in his driveway. He had changed back into his comfortable, dirt-stained denim jeans and his frayed olive-drab flannel shirt. He held a simple green plastic watering can. He moved with that same slow, deliberate grace, carefully pouring cool water over the roots of his blooming hydrangeas. Beside him, the 1970 Ford F-150 sat exactly where it always had, immovable and deeply scarred, catching the last warm rays of the fading sun. Arthur reached out his heavy, calloused hand, gently patting the rusted steel hood of the historic vehicle. The general took a slow, deep breath of the fresh suburban air, finally enjoying the absolute unbroken silence he had fought his entire life to earn. 30 miles away from the quiet, newly liberated streets of Shady Pines, the horrific reality of the situation was finally crashing down on Richard Vance. The interior of the federal holding facility was a stark, brutal contrast to his meticulously decorated suburban home. The room was entirely windowless, the walls painted a depressing institutional gray. It smelled faintly of industrial bleach stale coffee and absolute suffocating despair. The temperature was kept deliberately low, a psychological tactic that worked perfectly on the former Homeowners Association president. Richard sat violently shivering in a stiff, bright orange Department of Corrections jumpsuit. It was several sizes too large, hanging awkwardly off his narrow frame, a far cry from the cheap polyester suits he used to wear like armor. The arrogant chest-puffing swagger that had defined his entire pathetic existence was completely erased. He was entirely stripped of his power, his title, and his dignity. His wrists were chained to the heavy, scarred stainless steel table bolted directly into the concrete floor. The heavy metal door clicked open, and a senior special agent walked into the interrogation room. The agent didn't yell. He didn't slam his hands on the table to intimidate his suspect. He moved with the cold, bureaucratic efficiency of a man who dealt exclusively with high-level federal felons. He casually dropped a thick, devastatingly heavy manila file onto the reflective surface of the table. The sharp thud made Richard flinch violently. "Mr. Vance," the federal agent said, pulling out a metal chair and sitting down. His voice was devoid of any human sympathy, delivering the facts with the cold precision of a judge reading a final sentence. "Let us review the current situation. You're currently facing charges of wire fraud, grand larceny racketeering, and criminal extortion, all stemming from the incredibly sloppy financial records we pulled from your desktop computer. That's before we even discuss the attempted destruction of classified government property and the direct physical assault of a 4-star military officer. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head frantically. "I didn't assault anyone," he whimpered, his voice a pathetic high-pitched whine. "I just yelled at him. I was just enforcing the neighborhood bylaws. The military tribunal disagrees," the agent replied coldly, opening the file. "The federal prosecutor is currently seeking a minimum of 15 years in a maximum security penitentiary without the absolute possibility of early parole. But the criminal charges are just the beginning of your problems today." The agent pulled a single piece of paper from the file and slid it across the table. "Under the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, all of your financial assets have been permanently frozen." The agent continued, watching Richard's eyes widen in absolute horror. "Your domestic bank accounts, your retirement fund, and the hidden offshore shell account you set up to launder the illegal towing kickbacks, they are all zeroed out. Effectively, immediately, you have absolutely nothing." The heavy metal door clicked open again. A sharp-suited attorney walked into the interrogation room carrying a slim leather briefcase. For a fleeting, desperate second, Richard felt a surge of hope. He thought his panicked phone call from the holding cell had finally worked. "Oh, thank God," Richard gasped, leaning forward as far as the heavy chains would allow. "You're here. You need to get me out of here. This is all a massive misunderstanding." The attorney looked at Richard with a mixture of professional detachment and deep personal disgust. He didn't open his briefcase to pull out legal defense strategies. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and casually tossed a sealed white envelope onto Richard's manacled lap. "I'm not your defense attorney, Mr. Vance," the man said smoothly. "I represent your wife. She's citing your immediate federal incarceration, the complete forfeiture of your marital assets, and extreme public humiliation. Those are your divorce papers. She has already moved out of the house." Moved out. Richard choked, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. Where did she go? What about the house? The bank initiated rapid foreclosure proceedings approximately 2 hours ago, the attorney replied, turning toward the door. "The property was heavily leveraged against the fraudulent income you were generating. The house on Elm Street no longer belongs to you. Have a good afternoon, Mr. Vance." The attorney walked out, the heavy steel door slamming shut with a deafening, absolute finality. Richard Vance sat completely alone in the freezing room. He had literally lost his fake suburban kingdom, his stolen wealth, his marriage, and his freedom in a span of less than 6 hours. He buried his pale face in his chained hands and wept a hollow, pathetic sound that echoed uselessly off the sterile, unforgiving walls. Back at the Shady Pines cul-de-sac, the chaotic, deafening roar of the military intervention had completely dissipated. The heavily armored tactical vehicles had rolled out as swiftly and flawlessly as they had arrived. The massive shadow of the Black Hawk helicopter was long gone, replaced by the soft, warm hues of a late afternoon sun descending gracefully over the tree line. The street was incredibly profoundly quiet, but for the first time in nearly a decade, it wasn't the suffocating, oppressive silence of fear. It was the natural, comfortable tranquility of a neighborhood that had just been liberated from a relentless psychological siege. Doors slowly opened down the length of Elm Street. Neighbors stepped out onto their porches, blinking in the golden sunlight. There was no one marching down the sidewalk with a heavy leather clipboard. There was no one dropping to their knees to aggressively measure the height of the grass with a yellow plastic ruler. The petty draconian empire of Richard Vance had been entirely dismantled in a single afternoon. The residents looked at the pristine beige house at the end of the block. Across its perfectly painted front door, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had plastered a massive, highly visible federal seizure notice. It was the ultimate poetic irony. The man who had weaponized bright orange violation stickers against his own neighbors was now locked out of his own home by the absolute highest authority in the nation. The community could finally breathe without the paralyzing dread of receiving an exorbitant fine for an unapproved wind chime. Arthur Sterling stood on his front porch, completely unbothered by the lingering stares of his awestruck neighbors. He had casually discarded the crisp navy sweater, changing back into his comfortable, dirt-stained denim jeans and his frayed olive-drab flannel shirt. He didn't look like a four-star general who had just orchestrated a massive federal strike. He looked exactly like the quiet, unassuming retiree he had always wanted to be. He reached down and picked up a simple green plastic watering can, testing its weight in his massive, heavily calloused hands. He walked slowly down the wooden steps, moving with that same deliberate predator's grace, and approached his front garden. He tilted the can carefully, pouring a steady, gentle stream of cool water over the roots of his blooming hydrangeas. He worked with absolute methodical precision, his breathing perfectly steady, his mind entirely clear. Beside him, taking up the majority of the concrete driveway, the 1970 Ford F-150 sat exactly where it always had. The heavy steel J-hook of the Nightshade recovery tow truck had left a tiny, almost microscopic scratch on the reinforced front bumper. It was an entirely insignificant mark, just one more tiny scar added to a vehicle uniquely defined by its incredible history of survival. The truck hadn't moved a single inch. It stood as a silent, immovable monument, not only to the brave men who had bled inside its steel cabin, but to the absolute terrifying immovability of genuine discipline and true authority. Arthur finished watering the flowers. He set the green plastic can down on the concrete. He turned and took a slow, deep breath of the crisp, clean suburban air. The heavy scent of aviation fuel was finally fading, replaced by the familiar grounding smell of damp earth and blooming roses. He stepped closer to the historic truck, reaching out his thick right hand. He gently patted the rusted bullet-pocked steel of the hood, a quiet gesture of profound respect between two old soldiers who had flawlessly survived yet another ambush. As the final golden rays of the setting sun washed over the quiet street, a rare, genuine smile finally broke across Arthur Sterling's scarred face. The battle was officially over, and absolute peace had returned to Shady Pines. This story leaves us with a quiet truth about the choices we make when nobody is forcing us to be kind. Richard Vance didn't lose everything because one old truck sat in a driveway. He lost everything because he kept choosing pride over understanding, control over compassion, and humiliation over simple human respect. At every step he had a chance to pause. He could have asked a question. He could have listened. He could have treated Arthur like a neighbor instead of a problem to be erased. But every small, unkind choice became another stone in the wall he built around himself until that wall finally fell back on him. Arthur's strength came from a very different place. He didn't need to shout to prove he was powerful. He didn't need to insult Richard to prove he was right. He held his ground with patience, discipline, and a deep sense of responsibility. That kind of strength is rare because it asks more from us than anger does. Anger reacts quickly. Wisdom waits long enough to see clearly. Arthur understood that silence can be stronger than a threat, and restraint can protect more than pride ever could. The lesson is not that people should fear hidden power. The deeper lesson is that we should never measure a person by their clothes, their car, their age, their job, or the quiet way they move through the world. Every person carries a story we haven't heard. Some carry sacrifice. Some carry grief. Some carry years of service, loss, and courage behind a calm face. When we judge too quickly, we don't just misunderstand them, we also reveal something unfinished in ourselves. Real authority doesn't come from a title, a clipboard, a rule book, or the ability to make others nervous. Real authority comes from character. It comes from fairness. When we could be cruel, honesty when lying would be easier, and humility when we are tempted to feel bigger than someone else. Rules can help a community stay organized, but kindness is what helps a community stay human. Without kindness, even the neatest street can feel cold. With kindness, even a difficult moment can become a chance to build trust. This story also reminds us that consequences are not always loud at first. They often begin quietly, with a choice, a word, a look, or a refusal to listen. Richard's downfall was not created in one dramatic moment. It grew from a habit of looking down on people. And Arthur's peace was not protected by status alone. It was protected by patience, preparation, and the calm confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was. So when life puts us in front of someone we don't understand, maybe the best first move is not judgment. Maybe it's curiosity. Maybe it's a softer voice. Maybe it's the humility to say, I don't know the whole story yet. That small pause can save relationships, protect dignity, and keep a simple misunderstanding from becoming something much heavier. The people around us each carry invisible battles and quiet histories. The person who seems ordinary may be carrying wisdom we cannot imagine. The person who seems difficult may be carrying pain we cannot see. Offering respect and a little grace costs us nothing, but it can change the entire direction of a moment. In the end, the greatest victories are not the ones where we crush someone else. They are the ones where we protect what is right, choose responsibility over ego, and allow peace to return. May this story encourage us to look a little deeper, speak a little gentler, and act with more care. Because every interaction is a chance to build something good. Every choice leaves a mark, and the quiet kindness we show today may become the very thing that protects someone else's peace tomorrow.